In this lecture, we will go over Level 1 reading on monetary and fiscal policy. First, a few introductory remarks. Government decisions and actions can have a large impact on the economy. This is because governments are generally the largest employers and the largest borrowers in most economies. Broadly speaking, there are two types of government policy: monetary policy and fiscal policy. Monetary policy has to do with interest rates and money supply. Fiscal policy has to do with the spending and taxation decisions made by the government. The overall goal of these policies is generally stable economic growth and low inflation. The way this reading is organized, Section 2 describes monetary policy in a fair amount of detail, Section 3 covers fiscal policy, and then Section 4 is a short section which talks about the relationship between monetary and fiscal policy. Section 2, Monetary Policy. Monetary policy attempts to have an impact on the economy by influencing the quantity of money and interest rates. As I mentioned, this is a long section. It has several subsections which are shown here. We will talk about the concept of money, the role of central banks, the objectives of monetary policy. We will then understand what we mean by contractionary and expansionary monetary policies and the neutral rate. This is a neutral interest rate. And finally, we will talk about the limitations of monetary policy. At this stage, I want you to do example 1, which illustrates the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Section 2.1 deals with money. In order to understand the importance of money, let's think about a world without money. Such a world would have to rely on barter trade. And for barter trade to work, there would have to be a double coincidence of wants. This means that if farmer A, who produces cotton, wants milk, what he'll have to do is find some person who is willing to accept cotton in exchange for milk. And as you can imagine, this would be extremely inefficient. If we have money in an economy, then barter trades would not be necessary. Traditionally, money has been defined as a medium of exchange. And for money to be a medium of exchange, it must have the following qualities. It must be readily acceptable. It must have a known value. It must be easily divisible. This means that we should be able to buy goods and services with a low value, and we should also be able to buy expensive goods and services using money. Money should have a high value relative to its weight. This is simply a practical consideration, and obviously money should be difficult to counterfeit. You need to understand that money fulfills three important functions in a modern economy. As discussed, it acts as a medium of exchange. Money also provides individuals with a way of storing wealth. We save a certain amount of money now, and then this money can be used in the future. And finally, money provides society with a convenient measure of value and unit of account. The key point here is measure of value. When we go and buy a new car, and if the salesperson tells us that this car is for $20,000, then we know exactly what this number means. We've talked about the functions of money. Now let's consider the money creation process, and we'll go over an example which is presented in the curriculum. Let's say that in a given economy, the bankers come up with a reserve requirement of 10%. What this means is that when people deposit funds in a bank, then the bank is required to keep 10% as reserves, and the rest can be loaned out. So what happens if a customer makes a €100 deposit in the First Bank of Nations? This is shown as a liability on the balance sheet of the First Bank, and this is a liability because this money really belongs to the customer or the depositor, and the depositor can come at any point to the bank and demand this money. Given a reserve requirement of 10%, the bank must keep €10 and the rest can be loaned out. This money is loaned out to another customer. That customer will then go deposit the money in his bank, and let's say that is the Second Bank of Nations. Given the 10% requirement, the Second Bank of Nations must keep 9 as reserve and the remaining 81 can be loaned out. And this process can continue. So notice that with an initial deposit of 100, this was the initial amount of money. But because of the fractional reserve system, the actual amount of money in the economy is much more. That is because if you ask the first customer how much money he has, he will say he has 100. The second customer or the second person in this example will say that he has 90, and so on. So clearly the amount of money in the system is more than that initial amount of 100. As I mentioned, this is because of the fractional reserve system, and as you might have gathered, the fractional reserve system suggests or says that when a certain amount of money is deposited in a bank, a certain fraction, which is 10% or 1 over 10 in our example, must be kept as reserve and the rest can be loaned out. Because of this, the money created is more than 100. So how much money is created? There is a long mathematical proof for this, but all you need to recognize is that the amount of money created is equal to the new deposit, which is 100, divided by the reserve requirement, which is 10% in our example. This needs to be expressed as a decimal. So the money created is equal to 1,000. Here you also need to understand this term, the money multiplier, which is simply 1 divided by the reserve requirement. 1 divided by 0.1 is equal to 10. So in our example, the money multiplier is 10. Now I want you to do example 2 from the curriculum. Also do this simple example. You are given the reserve requirement and here is the additional deposit. How much money is created? The answer is quite straightforward. It is 500 divided by 0.08, which is 6250. We have talked about the functions of money and we have talked about the money creation process. Now let's understand exactly what we mean by money. So what is money? Going back to the previous slide, is money the €100 that was initially deposited because that was the actual paper money, or is money the €1,000 which essentially is a sum of all the deposits? In most economies, there are multiple definitions of money. We have a concept of broad money versus narrow money. Narrow money would be typically notes and coins and the most liquid deposits. Broad money would include narrow money plus less liquid deposits. If you look at Exhibit 3 in the curriculum, this gives the definition of money for several large economies. I have picked the definition for the United States, where narrow money is generally defined as M1. This comprises notes and coins in circulation, traveler's checks, demand deposits, and other deposits on which checks can be written. Simplistically, you can think of this as coins, notes, traveler's checks, and liquid deposits. M2 is a broader measure of money. This includes M1 plus savings accounts, money market deposits, time deposits less than 100,000 plus other balances in retail, money market and mutual funds. The larger point to understand here is that M2 is a broader definition of money which includes M1 plus other deposits which are less liquid than the deposits which are covered under M1. Also note that credit card balances are not considered part of money. We now come to the quantity theory of money, and this is quite important from a testability perspective. This theory asserts that the total spending in money terms is proportional to the quantity of money. And here is the equation which you need to remember, and we've seen this in an earlier reading also. The quantity of money multiplied by velocity is equal to price level into real output. The velocity of money stands for how often money changes hands in a given period. This equation can be used to explain the concept of money neutrality, and in simple terms, here is the concept. If we increase the amount of money supply and the velocity stays constant, then the price level will go up and the output will stay the same. In other words, we cannot increase our real output simply by increasing money supply. Connecting this with the monetarist school of thought, which we discussed in an earlier reading, according to monetarists, the price level or changes in price level are influenced by changes in money supply. So if we want to target a certain increase or a certain change in price level, that can be done through changes in the money supply. Demand for money. Demand for money is the amount of wealth that the citizens of an economy choose to hold in the form of money rather than in bonds or equities. This is an important point. So either the citizens of a country hold money in the form of money or cash, or they invest in bonds and equity. What are the motives for holding money? Here are the three major motives. Transaction related. We need to have money in order to do our transactions. Roughly speaking, transaction related balances are proportional to the GDP. As our economy grows, then the transaction related balances increase. The next category is precautionary. Here we keep a certain amount of money in order to protect against emergencies of different sorts. And finally, there is a speculative balance where if we speculate that bond markets and equity markets are not going to do well, then the amount of money or our demand for money then will be higher. On the other hand, if we expect the bond market and the equity markets to do well, then our demand for money will be low. Now I want you to do example 3 from the curriculum. The supply and demand for money. As with other markets, the price of money is determined by the interaction of demand and supply. This curve is the money demand curve, and if we have interest rates on the y-axis, quantity of money on the x-axis, then as interest rates go up, the quantity demanded goes down, and we just saw this on the previous slide. By interest rates, we are looking at the returns on other investments, so on stocks, bonds, etc. When we are getting better returns on stocks and bonds, then our demand for money will be less. That's why this is a downward sloping curve. The equilibrium interest rate is based on the intersection of supply and demand. And to understand this a little better, let's say that the interest rate is set at this high level of I1, then the supply of money will outstrip demand. If the supply of money is very high, that means that people will want to invest money. And let's say people invest in bonds. With lots of investors buying bonds, the price of bonds will go up. Price of bonds going up means that interest rates will come down. So the interest rate then will fall to this equilibrium point. And the same sort of argument can be used to show that if interest rates are set at a low point, then they will automatically adjust until we get to equilibrium. Another point has to do with the short-run impact of an increase in money supply and then the long-run impact. If there is an increase in money supply, then look at what happens to equilibrium rates. If money supply is shifted to the right, then interest rates come down. In the short run, that might increase aggregate demand because interest rates are lower. So in the short run, aggregate demand goes up. So in the short run, it is possible that output goes up. But as we saw in the previous reading, over time, the output will fall back down to its original level because real output is based on the real input, so the real amount of labor and resources. So eventually, what will happen is the price levels will go up and the output will come back to where it was originally. And this again goes back to the theory of money neutrality, which says that by simply increasing money supply, we cannot increase the output in the long run. We now come to the Fisher effect, which relates nominal interest rates with real interest rates and expected inflation. The relationship is quite straightforward. The nominal interest rate is equal to the real interest rate plus expected inflation. The Fisher effect is directly related to money neutrality because if the money supply is increased, that will have an impact on inflation and expected inflation. So that number will go up. The nominal interest rates will go up, but the real interest rate or the real returns will stay the same. And this concept of money neutrality keeps coming up, so I think it is quite important from an exam perspective. When we add an element of uncertainty to our investments, then we can say that nominal interest rates have three components: the required real return, expected inflation, and risk premium. This connects with material that you see in quantitative methods and fixed income, but the idea is straightforward. Let's say that we invest in a corporate bond where the return is 15%. This return has three components: the required real return, and let's say that number is 4%. There is an expected inflation. Let's say that we are in an environment where inflation numbers are relatively high. So let's say that inflation is 10%. This is actually expected inflation. And then 1% would be the risk premium. If we are investing in this bond, then clearly there is some uncertainty, there is some risk, and the premium that we as investors demand for that risk is reflected by the 1%. In fixed income, we will then further subdivide this into different kinds of risk, such as credit risk and liquidity risk. But here you just need to recognize that investors demand a return for the risk that they might be taking. Now I want you to do examples 4 and 5. Example 4 is extrememely important. This actually has some MCQ questions. And then example 5 you can go over if you have time. This talks about Margaret Thatcher's use of monetary policy in the UK.